to shed light on the intersex perspective, it's very difficult to sort of fit into the social standards of what a male or what a female is supposed to look and be like.
It's just so easy to then see how when you binarize or dichotomize something that actually has a huge range of diversity, it only results in exclusion and violence.
This myth around fairness in sport, that only certain differences would make a huge difference here, that because you're intersex, no one is investigating height, differences in sort of muscle composition, but it seems to be the central point of debate is because you're intersex, you can't participate in this sport.
The irony of surveillance is, if this is such a fact of nature, why do you have to put so much energy into policing and surveilling and checking up if it really is this thing? You are telling me that this is a fact of nature, and yet you spend all your time constantly checking, is it still?
Yeah.
Is it still?
But let me begin with a true story of a Ghanaian footballer who was excluded from the national team because a medical exam found her to be intersex. So in early May of 2021, the Ghanaian journalist Nwang Falong aired an interview with an aspiring national footballer, Halali Ativo. The interview was an opportunity for Ativo to share her experiences of being dismissed from the Ghanaian women's national team, the Black Queens. In the interview, Ativo explained how, although she had qualified for the national team through the various team trainings and those sorts of things, once she arrived at the camp, she was subjected to a medical exam that declared her intersex. And in her own words, she said, "I was a footballer, but they said I was intersex, so I can't compete with the women's side." And now she is unemployed, is trying to figure out what to do with herself, and has just been sitting at home. In other words, this kind of medical exam ended Ativo's football career in 2019, and she's no longer able to take part in the sport that she's been playing since she was a young girl and that she really loves. Now, some of you may be familiar with other African sportswomen like Ativo who have been excluded from sports because of an intersex condition. So athletes like Annette Nagesa, Caster Semenya, Bilgisa Simpori, and Salimata Simpori are some of the athletes whose stories have made it into mainstream newspapers. These are just a few African athletes who have been deemed not woman enough to compete in women's sports, although they have been raised as women, identify as women, and have lived their lives as women. What the experiences of these athletes highlight is how gender surveillance persists in women's sports. And this kind of surveillance affects athletes who are assigned female at birth, and also trans women who seek to participate in sports.
Gender. What an unbelievably suffocating concept. Yeah. It is interesting though to always, when you hear perspectives from different parts of the world, and you see that the resemblances that replicate themselves over and over and over. I mean, we have that example here in South Africa. The speaker mentioned Caster Semenya, which is one of our most famous examples. But I think for the fact that we have such a famous example, it's important for us to have a discussion about how this plays out and operates at an everyday level, right? When it's not the spectacle of media and all of that. And so, I mean, this clip really just makes me think, like, what kind of experiences are people having every day that we don't even see?
And to shed light on the intersex perspective, it's very difficult to sort of fit into the social standards of what a male or what a female is supposed to look and be like. So it's kind of frustrating to realize that for an intersex person, that journey starts at birth. From birth, just because a child does not meet the standards that society needs for a person to be assigned either female or male, it then continues on, even if a person maybe wasn't showing any ambiguous genitalia, that as a person grows into teenagehood, maybe they start developing opposite to the gender that they were assigned at birth. And then they find themselves having challenges, having to completely stop a career on something that is a natural phenomenon that has been existed for centuries. And so it's very difficult and sad to realize that things as small as the urgency of having safety in a normal restroom, for example, where an intersex person can be questioned, like, okay, why are you in this bathroom? Because we see this, and having to be challenged by having to prove themselves. And that is completely just dehumanizing. And there are far more examples, including bullying because of intersex phobia. And it is just crucial to understand that people really need to be educated and advocated for in this aspect.
Yeah, I think for me, what both this clip and what you've also said brings up for me is that even, beyond sport, but these binaries around sex and gender, I mean, it's just so easy to then see how when you binarize or dichotomize something that actually has a huge range of diversity, it only results in exclusion and violence. And I think, that's kind of fundamentally this idea that we have only two sexes when we know that there are actually a wide spectrum of sexes that come in a variety of forms. And that attempt to try and fit people into an either or is just, a recipe for exclusion. And I think what you also highlight and what Prof. Ajapong also highlights in the talk is that these have material consequences. For the footballer from Ghana, you are dismissed from your career and from something that you've worked really hard for. In the cases that you've raised as well, I mean, it has real material implications for people's lives and how they go about living every single day. And
I think those are very crucial points that you've all raised. And I'm also, to come back to Peace's examples, thinking about the sort of the question of surveillance and the kind of medical processes that intersex people are subjected to. And I'm just really reflecting on sort of the everyday and ordinariness of that violence. This idea that we feel like who actually makes one entitled to determine, this question of genetics and this question of, XY, the chromosomes, right? So, I mean, who's doing the gendering and who actually sets these rules? And I think it speaks to the whole impact of the whole medical industry. But also, the other thing is this myth around fairness in sport, right, that only certain differences would make a huge difference here, that because you're intersex, no one is investigating height, differences in sort of muscle composition, but it seems to be the central point of debate is because you're intersex, you can't participate in this sport, you can't use this bathroom, so you can't occupy a certain space, which is very violent and dehumanizing. Like you're saying, Jamie, this footballer actually lost an entire career. So it does have sort of material and everyday consequences that we really need to continue to think about. Yeah.
Interesting, though, the irony of, because we are told that the gender sex binary is like, it's a fact of life, it's a fact of nature.
Biology.
It is what it is, it exists,
Yeah.
and it's, in some people would also go as far as talking about it being sort of God ordained and all of that. But the irony for me often with regards to, and so yes, this is about an intersex person, but I mean, if there's a broader conversation around the gender and sexual diversity that exists in human beings, the irony of surveillance is, if this is such a fact of nature, why do you have to put so much energy into policing and surveilling and checking up if it really is this thing? You are telling me that this is a fact of nature, and yet you spend all your time constantly checking. Is it still?
Yeah.
Is it still?
Yeah.
Are you looking the right way? Are you behaving the right way? So clearly, the evidence for this, for it's the nature of it is very lacking and non-existent, and a lot of resources. And when I say resources, I'm not just talking about people spending their time and energy. Money goes into surveilling and checking and making sure. And there was something that you said earlier now about it's certain characteristics, right? The reason that people can do that and say, okay, this difference matters, but that difference doesn't matter. Some people are tall, okay, that's not that important. But when your hormones look a particular way, your genitalia looks a particular way, now the alarm bells are sounding. Can only do that. You can only do that because, again, you have invented this idea that certain characteristics must be allocated to a particular gender and others to another gender, and that there can never be overlaps or sort of congruencies between those things. But the point about surveillance is, and when we talk about surveillance, it's dangerous. It is so dangerous. And also, I mean, taking for granted, okay, the fact that this binary, that there is some kind of like truth to it, or that it is a fact, if you accept that idea, the margin for error is so huge, right? And it's happened so many times where somebody is misidentified as one gender versus the other. And again, my question becomes, if this thing is so natural and so easy to put into a binary, then you shouldn't be able to make mistakes, because it should be such an exact science, as you call it, right? But the point is, those mistakes have had severe and serious consequences for people, not only for their livelihoods, but also for their actual lives. People have lost their lives because somebody misidentified them as one thing versus the other. And it really comes down to the fact that if we didn't put these things in binaries, that wouldn't happen.
Yeah.
And to just pick up on your point about surveillance, it's actually quite disturbing that the surveillance will be on female athletes. And you hardly find these kind of issues when it comes to male athletes, because they don't, unless it's information that I haven't picked up, but there isn't anyone that I've read up on or found any research saying this male athlete was removed because they were found to be intersex. Because being intersex is not only a phenomenon that happens on typically female-looking bodies. It's a whole spectrum. And just to sort of also bring it back home to my personal experience, I went through a situation where a doctor was like, you must come back at a certain age and we'll do a certain surgery. And I'm like, but do I need to? What does that change? And the focus was on my sexual experience is not going to be satisfying for the next person. So meaning for a male person, I'm not going to be appealing or satisfactory enough, which also brings me to female bodies policed in that aspect of, is this athlete looking feminine enough for the people that are watching the sport? So it's very disturbing.
That is disturbing.
And Peace, in terms of policy, like, do you feel like there's uptake and like enough? I mean, is there an issue around workshopping, sort of knowledge, sort of spaces where you teach people about these things, or there's so much ignorance? So is it in the name of ignorance? So in your particular experience, is there a way of sensitizing sort of doctors and policymakers to say, I mean, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, there are many opportunities that are available. For example, at Iranti, there are different trainings and workshops that we've attended and provided information and sensitization to some doctors. Sometimes the feedback is not as positive because there's I guess the way that they're taught is very narrow. And so as the authority that doctors are given, sometimes it's very hard to challenge. And it's very important to then bring lived realities to them to say, because of surgery, this is how this implicated this human being. And because there wasn't any surgery, but there aren't any steps possible for, okay, so now for a body like this, what are the steps that the medical professions can help in order to just bring this person's wellness to the same capacity as any other human being? And speaking of laws, there is a Resolution 552 that is specific to promoting and protecting the rights of intersex children. And I think it's very important, and it's high time that those kind of resolutions are put to light, because there are general policies and laws that protect people within the LGBT community, within race, within cultures and things like that. But nothing really focusing on intersex people, because you're a human being. So for me, I'm a human being that looks female to a lot of people. And already I have those challenges that naturally come with that. Then on top of that, I'm intersex. So it's quite complex, but not at the same time. It just needs empathy and interest.
I want to go back to something you were also saying about if I can remember. But just this idea, what you were saying about, like male athletes also not being put under the same kind of suspicion and scrutiny. And I think that, again, that just kind of reinforces the kind of patriarchal order, right? That even within kind of sport, as one example, but we can, kind of extrapolate this to others as well, is that, it doesn't matter if a man has lower testosterone, because, the idea is that the testosterone is what makes them stronger and a better athlete and things like that. So it's just also kind of reinforcing that kind of hierarchy in which, which even makes apparently a testosterone hierarchy, which is just, sounds absurd.
And again, that has been disproven in real time.
Yes.
A woman athlete said, okay, if you say that it's inherent in you to be better than me, then let's do this. And she won the match. Yeah. Billie Jean King.
Yes.
I mean, and I'm sure there's so many other examples. So again, it's like the evidence for this binary logic has to be invented on the spot, and as you go along to make sure that it. And I mean, this is also a point that we made in the previous conversation, which was the alarm bells will always start ringing when who is considered to be a female athlete is now a bit too good. Too good for a woman. Because there must be limits to how skilled or good a woman can be, surely. Because otherwise the binary will fall on its face. Because if this category that you are saying is lesser, actually then transcends its own boundaries, then the whole thing falls apart, right? But I mean, inherent in that suspicion is you are too good for a woman. But that the reason why you're too good is because you are too much like a man. And inherent in that assumption is that men are inherently good at everything.
Yes, exactly.
So on the one hand, it's like you are not enough of a woman. But implied in that is that you are too much of a man. Right? Yeah. But you're in the wrong body. So now the optics are now looking a little bit crazy.
And I just want to also emphasize, because, the clip that we were responding to was also made the example of entirely African women athletes. And I think it's important that we also, think about what women are scrutinized, what women's bodies are scrutinized and believed to be not woman enough or too masculine. And it's predominantly Black women that their femininity gets questioned. And, this goes back to, the kind of establishment of such sex and gender binaries in which, femininity and what is considered to be a woman is in the image of a white woman that also, must stick to the norms of what femininity is as well. But But still, that's the kind of ideal, and Black women, also become the kind of suspicious other that gets more scrutinized as well. And it's a lot of white women in these sports that are also actively pointing the finger. And I just think it's important to also acknowledge that white women's roles in perpetuating, patriarchy, heteronormativity, all of these things as well. By selling out particularly Black women.
Yeah. And I like the phrasing or the phrase you use, not woman enough, because I'm also thinking that it actually, the framing of not human enough, because it's basically a denial of humanity, to be pushed out of the labor market, to not be able to work because you are intersex I think it's a very, obviously it's a very dehumanizing experience, but it's also saying, you're not human enough. And I always wonder which pockets then of belonging, in such a scenario, what is the assumption around where intersex people can actually belong? Because it's basically, you're basically saying it's not going to happen. Like, it's really a denial of all of the rights associated with working and being human. And I think that's my other concern. And I like the fact that you bring in the question of race, because it also makes us to think about the way these things connect and feed into a bigger picture of this is about the intersex body, but it's also about women's bodies. It's also about Black people's bodies, and who has the right to point the other out. I know the example Venus has experienced quite a lot, like the Williams sisters.
Serena as
Yeah,
well,
Serena and Venus, and that whole idea that you look masculine. That definition of you're too good for this sport. You shouldn't be playing with other women. You should actually be playing with. And there was quite a lot around race there. That denial of playing tennis because you look masculine, but because you are also Black. So it becomes undesirable femininity as well.
And can I just say, sorry, to just jump back in, because then white women also become the victims then. If it's like, in that situation, then and it's like that complete like recasting. And I laugh because it's just like the absurdity of it, But like the track athletes, the women, the white women track athletes that are calling out Caster Semenya, then they get to occupy this space of being the victim when Caster was the one that had to undergo bodily exams, medical exams on a international level. To just be under that level of scrutiny and your body dissected in the media and by people, by doctors, and by a sports body. To then recast like white women somehow as the victims that they can't compete fairly against. It's just like the absurdity of it.
And it stems from a very dangerous history. And I always go back to the fact that it really, like when we talk about the history of the construction of gender and all of this, it was not even that long ago when Sojourner Truth was asking, ain't I a woman? Like that, and again, that's specifically around the exclusion of Black women from womanhood, right? Because the category was inherently white, right? And so it always, whenever I think about this stuff, it always brings me back to the fact that this idea that there are two genders that are neatly linked to two sexes is such a new idea in the history of the world. For centuries and centuries before, Indigenous people all across the world have had such a wide array of understandings and conceptualizations of this thing called gender, that for it to, like I say, for it to hold so much power now, in such a short space of time, it really is astounding. But I can't say that without making the point that this has been institutionalized and normalized through the use of force and violence, Yeah.
Most definitely. And like at this point, I've always seen it as a big attempt of making the intersex body extinct. Like it just must not exist. And it happens on all levels, where a child is immediately boxed. And then if a person grows up and experiences something different, there is this huge block to a point where a person just decides not to participate in life, because how do you go on without having an identity document that reflects who you are? And in that, it's so small that even if a person wants to exist as non-binary, you don't have that option. You can only exist as male or female, but you're literally neither of the two. It's not a true reflection of who you are. So it's still a process that I hope to live to see change. Because we're in the greater world, there are differences, there are changes that have been implemented, and I hope that eventually we as a country will look to those countries and see how the changes have happened and how they've positively impacted the society, because it is necessary to have intersex people have their space to live.
Yeah.
Yes.
It's such an important point that you made there about the idea of extinction,
Yes.
because as the phrase was used in the studio a few minutes ago, is yes, these ideologies are driven by a genocidal impulse to eradicate, to disappear, from view. And when we think about that, it's important that when we talk about systems of oppression, be it gender, be it race, to understand that it's not just it's like, oh, it's just one of those things. No, there is actual genocidal impulse behind this ideology, and left unchecked and if not resisted to, it will achieve its goal.
And the silence around it only furthers, the kind of adopted ignorance, the kind of looking away.
Important to resist.
It
always.
is.